Well, Your Excellency, you've got a lot going on with end of the academic year and ordinations and planning the move of the seminary and doing renovations. So it's not that surprising you haven't had a chance to write a blog post or write something in the newsletter about what's going on in Ukraine. So we thought that we'd take a few moments here and give a Catholic perspective on what's happening and a historical one as well. So I think probably what makes the most sense is to ask, how is it that Ukraine came to be a country as we know it?
Well, actually, Ukraine in the Middle Ages was organized to a certain extent as a nation, as a people. Kiev came long before Moscow. Moscow was a little village on the Moscow River to the north. Kiev was a functioning monarchy at the time, and in the 1100s, and was evangelized by Byzantine priests, and so it's actually older than Russia. Russia is Muscovy. That means the Moscow territories, and finally became Russia. But the name Rus actually comes from Ukraine. That's what the early was Ukrainian. So their roots are really in Ukraine. Russia's roots are in Ukraine, but then it became disorganized, and it became overrun by Lithuanians and Poles, and for a long time lived under their domination. And then the Russians got it in the 1600s, and there was an attempt to free themselves from the Muscovite Russians. That was a time, but that failed, and by the end of the 1600s, they were part of the Russian Empire. And they have continued as part of the Russian Empire. They continued as part of the Russian Empire until 1917, when eventually there was, of course, the revolution, and by the early 1920s, they were part of the Soviet Union. So that's a very brief history of Ukraine. But yes, they've been dominated for a great deal of their existence by foreign powers.
So in more modern times, when do we see Ukraine becoming its own country?
Well, according to the three constitutions of the Soviet Union, 1924, 1936, and 1977, the republics, and I think there are 16, all have the ability to secede at any time they want from the Soviet Union. In principle, this is Stalin, probably get sent to Siberia if you tried, but in principle, you could pull out anytime you wanted. So in that sense, they were considered, the Soviet Union was a federation of independent republics. So in that sense, it was a separate country. In fact, no. It was a province of the Soviet Union and under the thumb of Moscow. So they really didn't become an independent country until 1991, when they exercised that right in the Soviet Constitution to become independent.
And so when we look at this, do we need to look to the period that you're talking about, the Middle Ages, or do we look back to 1991 when we're looking at this conflict, or somewhere in between?
Well, history is history. You look at the whole thing. They are a separate people. They are not Russians. They are Ukrainians. They have a lot in common with Russia. Russia borrowed a great deal from Ukraine. The Russia is the child. Ukraine is the parent. But the roles became reversed. You have to look at the whole history. They would consider themselves, I think, a different people from the Russians. They, from my understanding, they detest the Russians. The Russians were extremely cruel to them in the 1930s. Stalin starving out probably 10 million kulaks. Those are independent farmers who resisted the collectivization. And so, you know, there is no love lost between Ukraine and Russia. I think the more modern history is more relative to the situation here.
Insofar as and I suppose narratives, competing narratives, the Ukrainian narrative, we are a separate people, and in fact, some of us incline towards Europe, and we want the umbrella of NATO protection. And the Russian narrative, where we have so much common history together, we have language that's similar, we should be together somehow. You should not join the West, and that's going to cause problems for us. So these are would you say that that's the competing narrative?
Yes, that is as I see it, Ukraine, despite the fact that it is a separate people, despite the fact that Russia has treated it horribly over the years, nonetheless has very strong cultural, lingual, and religious ties to Russia. It's impossible to deny that. It is more of an Eastern European country than it is a France or a Spain or a Germany. It has far more in common with Russia than it has with any of those Eastern European countries, Western European countries. So I think that it would have been in Ukraine's interests to realize that not only are we historically and culturally attached to Russia, but also that we are living next to a fire-breathing dragon that is enormous and is armed to the teeth with nuclear weapons, and also a big standing army that is well equipped and has a history of aggression. That's a reality. It's not a good reality. It's not a happy reality, but it is the reality. And therefore, in my opinion, it was imprudent for them to look to the West, given especially the enticements of the West. And there's the West coming to them and saying, "Oh, please be with us. You'll be, a much better life with us, and you can dump Russia and be with us, and you can be part of the EU. You can be part of NATO, and Russia can just mind its own business." I think that was a very imprudent move on their part. As an independent country, they can do whatever they want. So, I mean, they were not outside of their bounds with regard to what they could do. If they wanted to join NATO, they could. If they wanted to join the EU, they could. But nobody wants a hostile alliance in their backyard, in his backyard. You see, NATO was formed as a military buffer against an aggressive Russia. Ukraine sits, in regard to Russia, something like the liver in your chest. In other words, it is very much there. And it also has, as part of its territory, Crimea, which is Russia's one door to a 365-day per year warm water port, and its open door to the Mediterranean. Otherwise, all of its ships have to go through the Baltic Sea, the North Sea, and who knows who's going to fire at them. I mean, all of the Northern European routes through the English Channel and around, in order to get through to the Far East, their own Far East, to go through the Suez Canal and around. This way they can go through the Dardanelles and go out straight into Egypt and cross through the Suez Canal. So from the point of view of their own trade, the point of view of their own contact with their own East, and their military and naval interests. Crimea, which is part of Ukraine, we'll talk about that in a little bit, but is of extraordinary and essential military and diplomatic and economic interest to them. It's essential to Russia's interest, the Crimea. That's where their warships are kept. It's like our Norfolk, Virginia. You see, so I think Ukraine should have thought of these things. That is this a good idea? Are we so attached to Russia, for better or for worse? Are we so attached to Russia that this would be a bad idea to thumb our nose at Russia and just say we're going to go with the West? And who knows, you'll see NATO ships pulling in right next to your battleships and your aircraft carriers in our ports. You'll see the Americans come in and the British and submarines and whatnot, and you might see nuclear weapons pointed at Moscow right in your backyard. Now, go back to 1962 when the Russians put in missiles in Cuba. What did we do? We had a fit. Right? I remember I was alive. It seems like I've been alive forever. But
I heard there were long lines for confessions, and people were worried.
Oh, I was 12 years old. I mean, we were going to be attacked. I remember it. It was the end. And Kennedy got on television at the time and said, this is very serious. And it came to light later, I read in a book, that Khrushchev had a single missile that he could have delivered to the United States. One missile. But it seemed like Russia, we lived in fear of Russia during the 50s and 60s, and we were going to be attacked. We had fallout shelters. We had... you
had effective technique of crawling under your desk.
Yes, we had to crawl under the desk to protect us from a nuclear bomb. People bought fallout shelters for their homes, so we lived in fear of them. When I went to Russia in 2008, I stood in Red Square. I couldn't believe. I looked at the Kremlin and all of the surroundings, that big Red Square, St. Basil's Cathedral. I could not believe what I was seeing, that I was standing there in the place that we feared with the depths of our souls when I was growing up. I just couldn't believe it. I just had to stare at it. It was a reality that could not penetrate. That the relationship would have warmed enough that I could do that. It was very moving. I'll never forget it. So anyway, and the Russians said, I said, this is very amazing to me that, for years we thought we were going to be attacked by the Russians. They said, for years we thought we were going to be attacked by the Americans. That was the fear in Russia.
I suppose them going to Washington, D.C., where they would have the similar reaction.
The same. There were some Russian seminarians at the time. They're no longer here. But it was an interesting trip. So getting back to so I think that Russia is looking at Ukraine, flirting with the EU, flirting with Washington, the West, flirting with NATO, and the thought of having NATO warships in Crimea, and I think they had a fit too. And they saw their democratically elected president of Ukraine just ousted unconstitutionally in 2014, I think it was. Yanukovych, I think his name. Just ousted in an insurrection. Just get rid of him. And then some sort of kangaroo parliament, decided he wasn't president
allegedly
anymore.
Spontaneous.
Yeah, it's just ridiculous. And that was the beginning of this affront. And Ukraine also contains two provinces to the east that are practically Russia. That is the Donbass region, where they speak Russian and where the Russian Orthodox Church is established. So it's not the Ukrainian Orthodox. So it's practically Russia. It just happened to be with Ukraine. How it ended up with Ukraine, I don't know. but it did. And they also had Crimea, which is Russian language. Everything, it was taken over by Catherine the Great in the late 1700s from ultimately Turkey. Turkey was not actually Turkish property, but there was a Khan. There was a Khanate. That means like a duchy that was a vassal of Istanbul. So effectively, it was Turkish Empire. They got it. It was always part of Russia, Crimea. And Khrushchev, or Khrushchev is the proper pronunciation, in 1954, gave it away to Ukraine. Now, he was not known as an intellectual giant in any terms at all, but that was an extremely stupid thing to do, because according to the Russian Constitution of 1924, 1936, and 1977, those republics had the right to secede at any time. Why would you give away something that is essential to your security as a nation and your naval bases to a country that could secede at any time?
Well, as you say, Your Excellency, it was just on paper, right? He assumed the status quo forever into eternity, and why would Ukraine leave?
Yes. However, I'm just making sort of the case of both sides here. So I think in this conflict, I think there is a certain fault of imprudence on the part of Ukraine, although strictly speaking, they're in their rights, but an imprudence to detach themselves from Russia, and not only do that, but also court the enemies of Russia. But there was also a price to pay that Russia has to pay, and that is its cruelty toward Ukraine in the 1930s and at other times. It's the stupidity, the utter idiocy of Khrushchev to give away Crimea that had been conquered by Russia, not by Ukraine, but by Russia, to give it away. It'd be like giving Virginia away to somebody that could potentially just walk away with it. And also the aggressive nature of Russia, that Russia is something to be feared because historically it has been so aggressive so I think Russia has a price to pay too, that it had 70 years of a communist government which was a disaster for that country. In all respects, a disaster. If they had not shot the Tsar, if the Tsar Nicholas had still been in place, they would, or his successors, they would still have Ukraine as part of the Russian Empire. Russia was never so extended as under the Tsars, and never so reduced as under post-communism. I mean, it was a disaster of a government, and I think they should turn and say, we have to pay that price for the things that we did as a nation to our neighbors. And no wonder they want to get away from us, because we're so horrible. So I think there's something on both sides there. And I would say definitely Russia is wrong to invade Ukraine. They are a sovereign country. They have the right to do what they want. But I understand their motives, that this is something that is intolerable on our front door. That's their motive. And I just don't think they have the right to do it, though. I think they have to look back at their own selves and say, we did this. That's my opinion.
Well, on top of that, despite how irritating, as you already noted, with NATO, the EU, this courtship from the West, that Catholic just war theory doesn't allow for a preventative invasion, you could call it, of a country.
No, it's an independent country. It can do what it wants. And Russia cannot interfere with that. It is an immoral war on the part of Russia, I would say.
And I think that narrative is troubling, should be troubling to some traditional Catholics who want to see Putin as some sort of crusader. But there's several problems with that narrative. One, both countries, both leaders approve of gay marriage.
Yes.
And there are more, in all of Ukraine, smaller country that it is than Russia, there are more Catholics than in all of Russia.
Yes.
And so it's an Orthodox invasion of a plurality Catholic country by a leader who is who is fine with gay marriage. So how can he be labeled as a crusader?
There was also unlimited abortions in Russia. Russia has always had
the highest per capita in the world.
Yes, and Russia is still has a love affair with communism. And you can see it when I was there in 2008. Lenin is still, and to this day still, in Red Square in a noble setting and with guards around him, etc. The body of Lenin, and nobody even knows if it really is Lenin. It could be a wax thing. But supposedly Lenin, I mean, he's held. And then you see the towers of the Kremlin, which under Stalin and under the Soviet Union all had red stars at the top of each tower. And now you see one has a red star, the other has the eagle, the Tsarist eagle, a two-headed eagle, and then there's a red star, and then there's an eagle. And I thought, this is Russia today.
They're trying to have it both ways.
They're having it both ways. And you then you walk a little bit further, and you see the Lenin Library and a big statue of Lenin in front of the library. That's the main library in Moscow. Another little park where you see a bust of Karl Marx. And, you know, a few years ago, the Russian Orthodox Church said to Putin, it's time to de-Leninize Russia. And he said, it's not time yet. Lenin, I mean, the man was the devil incarnate. So, I mean, Russia has not purified itself of communism, and it could easily go back into communism. I understand the fears of Ukraine with regard to that. Russia is not a converted country. It's a mixed bag country of both socialism, communism, and certain freedoms. But you see how people disappear in Russia, just like under Stalin. They get poisoned. He suppresses opposition. I mean, the only thing missing for Putin with regard to Tsardom is the uniform and the capes and all of that stuff. But he is a czar. The Russians love a czar, and that's fine that they have a czar, but there is still the secret police. There is still all of the things that they detested under the czar, and all of the things that they detested even more under the Soviet rule.
He comes from the FSB, KGB. He can't escape who he is. This is...
He was a KGB agent, yes. He was a colonel, I think, in the KGB. You know, he was high up in the KGB, and they tortured everybody. I saw the building when I was there, where they tortured people. I mean, this is they have not shed their communist past.
To be fair, on that point, they did, at least Putin, I think, was seen as more progressive in 1999 and 2000 when he came to power, that he tried some kind of rapprochement with NATO because he saw this as a looming problem. He had lived in Germany, was there during the unification, and he wanted to make sure that this NATO Warsaw Pact gap wouldn't get even deeper. But we were not interested. And in part, I think this has to be said, the military-industrial complex to exist needs an enemy. And who's more of an enemy than Russia, dating back to your childhood, as you noted? They're still considered the enemy to this day by Americans. Remember that they're in. If an election is rigged,
it's the Russians.
You know,
if the gas is high, it's the Russians.
If you got COVID, clearly it was Putin's fault.
Yes, definitely. Yeah. The real enemy is China, but of course we are, really cozy with China. They are the real threat, not Russia.
And I think too, we can't ignore the fact that we live in a post-World War II, post-Cold War era in which a lot of Europeans fear one invasion leads to another invasion leads to another invasion. So for them, understandably, there is a fear this invasion will lead to another invasion. And despite the fact that historically, apart from the Cold War, it's usually Europe that invades Russia. It's not Russia that has historically invaded Europe.
Yeah, true. It's true. That is true. Napoleon, Hitler, although it did mobilize against Germany, it really was the first to mobilize in World War One. But it had a treaty with Hitler, up to 1941.
So there's some headlines that Bergoglio is going to consecrate Russia, and this has gotten some trads in a tizzy. What do you make of Bergoglio making this move?
Well, as I said to someone, it would be very nice if he were a true pope and the bishops were true bishops. It would be a very nice thing to do. But I think it's showbiz, frankly. I think he is a humanitarian, and I think he's just using this as a way of stirring up sentiment for peace. I don't think he has any. I don't think he believes in God. In my opinion, I don't think the man believes in God. He's not a Catholic, so I put very little. I think it's just showbiz. That would be the way I would put it.
So where do you see this ending, Your Excellency?
What's this?
This crisis, this current war. Do you see a resolution? Do you see it as changing the status quo in Europe permanently?
Well, I think what he wants to do is restore a pro-Russian government in Ukraine. I think that's what he wants to do. I understand that, but I think his means are evil. What is surprising is that the Russian armed forces are not doing that well in Ukraine. I mean, I thought that it would be over in about 72 hours.
Or even shorter.
Or shorter, yes. I mean, Russia? Ukraine? I mean, Ukraine is a big country, but it has a lot of people in it. But the Russian military, I mean, it's legendary. But they are getting bogged down.
It's been a long time since they've actually fought a hot war, I suppose.
Yes, it's alarming. Well, in a sense, it's very surprising that they have not overrun that country in a matter of days, despite the fact that they're being brutal. And yes, they are committing war crimes. They are not targeting the military. They are bombing apartment houses. They're bombing children. This will set Russia back 200 years, because they are showing that barbaric side that they have in them. Every time they go to war, there's a barbarism that comes out. Every time they deal with other peoples, there's a barbarism in them. And here it is again, that they cannot conduct this, even though it's an unwarranted war, that they cannot conduct it in such a way as to at least be decent. I think it will set them back, just like Hitler has set back Germany for 2 centuries. I think Russia will be set back for 2 centuries, no matter what the outcome of the war.
But do you not think Ukraine could save face and be practical here and give Donbass and the other region back and say, we won't join NATO?
He's already said we won't.
Sign some treaty. So it looks like the invasion has already had some kind of effect that Putin wanted, which was some kind of extracted promise like this.
Yes, I think the Russians will ask for those for Crimea. Well, they already have it.
They'll want a confirmation in law that Crimea is recognized by Ukraine as being part of Russia.
Yes, and I think they will want those 2 provinces. Those are highly industrialized provinces. And I'm sure Ukraine does not want to give them up. But again, I would say, although Ukraine was within its rights, I think it acted very imprudently and should have foreseen that it has enraged the fire-breathing dragon that it lives next to. Like your next-door neighbor, you could reach out and touch his house, you don't do that. If you live next to a fire-breathing dragon, you don't poke it with a stick.
It feels like a slow motion trap, actually, insofar as we've talked in other contexts about the Franco-Prussian War, and that was just sprung. But in this case, this has been building for many years. It dates back, the problems date back most recently to the 2014.
Yes, the ultimate at fault here is the United States and the European Union. They are the ones ultimately and mostly at fault with regard to this debacle taking place in Russia and Ukraine.
You're saying we're to blame, Your Excellency?
Absolutely. Absolutely, we're to blame. Let us mind our own business, as George Washington told us. Here we are surrounded by 2 oceans. Let the rest of the world do what it wants. We are not the policemen of the world. We don't have to worry about the politics of the world. If somebody attacks us, we will respond. We should be strong militarily, and where no one would ever go near us for fear of what would happen to them.
We're not worried about the Canadians invading.
No, the Canadians are fine. But we sit in a very, very strategic position. 2 oceans. Our only soft spot is Cuba and that area. But this idea of it started with Wilson, that somehow we have to bring Americanism to the whole world and democratize the whole world, and that will bring us peace. It's done a wonderful job since 1918, bringing peace to the world. Look at all the peace that we have. It just overturns the Americans and the Europeans with us go into these countries and overturn things and try to bring the West to these countries, making Iraq into for example, a democratic institution like the United States. Get off of it. That's ridiculous. They have never had that. It's totally against the whole history and culture of Iraq.
We're invading Iraq to make sure that women can have the right to vote and drive, and that
wear pants,
gay rights can flourish.
The whole thing. I know, and America, the trash that we have, our culture is trash. It is immoral. It's filthy. It's disgusting. It's pornographic. We want to export this to the world. I mean, one of the good effects, and I was told this by somebody who lived in Poland, one of the good effects of the Iron Curtain was that the corruption of the West was kept out of those Eastern countries. He said that you couldn't even listen to rock music. You would not hear rock music on the radio or in any kind of public setting before the Iron Curtain was lifted in 1989. And
unfortunately, they've caught up quite a bit.
They have. And all of the corruption of the West is one big corrupt mass, a big mass of corruption. And cultural, moral, political, everything is wrong with it. And for us to try to export that, we should be ashamed of it, frankly.
So to conclude, Your Excellency, you do think that it's likely that this comes to some kind of political settlement rather than expanding into a larger conflict?
I think so. I think that just an opinion, the fact that the Russians have not prevailed so far, I think there's something deeply wrong with their military. And I think they have to come to the reality, too, that we're not going to take this over in a few weeks or anything like that. And that and you can see some movement with the Ukrainians that we won't join NATO. And, I think they want to see an end to it, too. So I think in probably the next month or two, you're going to see some progress that way.
Well, thank you for sharing your thoughts, Your Excellency.
Thank you very much.